Good afternoon, everyone. We're just going to give folks a few minutes to start to trickle in. We'll get going in just a little bit. So we're going to get going in just another minute. I see folks are still trickling in. So just hang tight for another minute. All right. Well, I'm going to start to introduce this webinar as folks continue to trickle in. So welcome to the first of MACAN's 2025 webinar series. We have a couple more coming, and I'll tell you about those in a minute. But today we're going to be talking about the responsible deployment of marine carbon dioxide removal, strategies, and case studies. So just for some general information, we will have a Q&A/comment section at the end, which we expect to be about 15 to 20 minutes time. So if you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A box or in the chat. We'll be monitoring both, and all participants are muted. So we don't have the option for back and forth discussion, but we will certainly attend to any of the comments that we see. This webinar is also co-sponsored with Marco's Coastal Carbon Collaborative Work Group. And if you would like any further information on that, you can contact me. My email address is on the screen. And some upcoming webinars that we have are March 26th. We have ocean acidification and harmful algal blooms, impacts of co-stressors on shellfish growth and development, given by Chris Gobler from Stony Brook University. And then on April 21st is Blue Carbon webinar. It's a blue carbon based webinar on seagrass restoration and carbon accreditation by Jill Bieri from the Nature Conservancy, and the role of submerged aquatic vegetation in inorganic carbon cycling by Cassie Gerbitz from St. Mary's College in Maryland. So for any of you who are not familiar with MACAN or the other coastal acidification networks, we're all scientists, federal, tribal, and state agency representatives and resource managers, as well as non-governmental organizations and other industry partners from around the fishing industry and aquaculture industry. MACAN focuses from Long Island Sound to coastal Virginia, and we often partner on the East Coast with NECAN to the north of us and SOCAN to the south. And I also want to give a shout out to the Caribbean Coastal Acidification Network that just formed this past fall. So we're now 7 total coastal acidification networks throughout the United States. And MACAN's goals are really to guide regional observation research and modeling, to understand local drivers of coastal and ocean acidification. We contribute to studies that will help predict the consequences for marine resources and local communities. And we coordinate over best practices for monitoring and data collection, as well as educating stakeholders on coastal and ocean acidification impacts and solutions. MACAN is a partnership between the Mid-Atlantic Regional Association Coastal Ocean Observing System, or MARICOOS, and the Mid-Atlantic Regional Council on the Ocean, or MARCO. So I do have speaker bios, but I actually forgot to print them out. So I'm going to go off of memory. So we have Amelia Juliet Demery from Ocean Visions and Sarah Narwaz from American University. And I will actually let you guys, if you want, give just a really brief intro yourselves. So Juliet, why don't you go first?
Thanks, Janet. Hi, everyone. I'm Amelia Juliet Demery. I'm Program Officer at Ocean Visions. Bio. Okay, going off of memory. So I just started at Ocean Visions this year. I previously spent 2 years at the U.S. National Science Foundation and their Division of Ocean Sciences, where I contributed to high-level strategies and guidance documents like the Ocean Climate Action Plan, the Ocean Justice Strategy, and the Environmental Justice Science Data and Research Plan, the latter two of which I'll be talking about today. My expertise is not in the oceans. I'm an evolutionary biologist of birds. So I bring this network analysis perspective to looking at different types of strategies and processes for using, science to inform policy management decisions for our oceans. Anything else I should say, Janet? It's 9 a.m. over here, so coffee hasn't kicked in.
Sarah, if you want to give your bio now, and then you can do your presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Sarah Nawaz. I am an environmental social scientist and a director of research at the Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal at American University. And I also am affiliated and doing a fair bit of work through the University of British Columbia. And I have been working on marine CDR for a few years now. And yeah, that's basically carbon removal is really all I work on these days. And my background is sort of broadly in how we think about how public groups and communities and people are thinking about new technologies in the kind of environmental and climate space. And a lot of my work these days has really been around community engagement on mCDR. And so I'll talk a lot about that in my presentation, but I think I'm also just broadly interested, as our kind of institute is interested, in questions of, yeah, what does it mean to roll out a CDR sector in responsible ways? And how can we kind of ensure that we're not just doing CDR, but doing it in ways that are really attentive to kind of social, political governance aspects.
Great.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you both. And I'm going to shoot it over to you, Amelia.
Thank you. All right, let me share my screen. All right, can you see the not presentation view, but the actual presentation slide?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. Like Jana said, I'm Amelia Juliet Demery, Program Officer at Ocean Visions. Ocean Visions is a nonprofit whose goal is to advance new solutions to stabilize the climate and restore the ocean. Today, I'm not going to be speaking on behalf of Ocean Visions. I'll be speaking on my previous experience at the U.S. National Science Foundation. I was a Canals Marine Policy Fellow and then a science assistant. And in these roles, I worked on multiple guidance and strategy documents for policy and research. I should have also said in my bio that one of the strategies was the National mCDR research strategy. But two of which I'm discussing today are going to be the Ocean Justice Strategy and the Environmental Justice Science Data and Research Plan as ways to strengthen equitable research design for ocean acidification and mCDR projects. So you can think of me as as a private citizen, not representing the NSF, and then also not representing Ocean Visions. Okay. Setting the scene. I'm going to go over both strategies, broadly framing their content and showing through different ideas and case studies how both could be used to further equitable research at state and local scales. I wanted to note that given the times and climate that we're in, where word choice can create knee-jerk reactions, I just wanted to emphasize that these strategies are designed to foster better science and public service in a way that enhances the strengths of existing programs or can strengthen the foundations of a new program. And this can include tangible outcomes like filling in data gaps that are missing from short-term quantitative or qualitative processes, as well as working towards long-term coalition building strategies that continue to be essential to not just policy, but research and development of technologies like mCDR in a way that can inform policy and impact communities. So where did these strategies come from? The Ocean Justice Strategy was developed by the Ocean Policy Committee, or OPC, which is charged to coordinate federal actions on ocean-related policy matters. And that can include engagement and collaboration with the ocean community, facilitating coordination and integration of associated federal activities, identifying priority ocean science and technology needs, as well as leveraging resources and expertise to maximize the effectiveness of associated federal investments. You can see that leadership is split between the Council of Environmental Quality and the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And then there are subcommittees in ocean science and technology and ocean resource management, with leadership split among 7 departments, agencies, and offices. And then there's more. Under that are more than 30 departments and agencies. So it's a very big group for coordinating at an interagency scale. And then we have the Environmental Justice Science Data and Research Plan that sits within the National Science and Technology Council. And the council is at the same level of the OPC. It fulfills similar functions as the OPC, but it is much broader. It covers all science and technology, and it is more aligned with the president's stated goals and science and technology policy agenda. So both of these presiding bodies over these strategies are very large, very interagency, very overarching in their purviews. So focusing on OPC products and activities, the past few years have generated multiple guidance materials on ocean policies, and they include, but they're not limited to, cross-cutting broader initiatives, economic strategies, science and technology efforts, security and mapping, and interagency coordination to synergize and maximize efforts. The Ocean Climate Action Plan, or OCAP, was released in March 2023, and it reflects a whole-of-government approach to identify, catalyze, and sustain ocean climate solutions. It was designed to serve as a guide for federal agencies as they look to meet the Biden administration's climate goals through strategic investments and policy strategy. Environmental justice is one of the OCAP's cross-cutting themes. So to support this work, the OCAP had called for an ocean justice strategy to be developed. In the vein of the Ocean Policy Committee's roles, the purpose of the Ocean Justice Strategy, or OJS, is to identify barriers and opportunities to fully integrate environmental justice principles into federal ocean activities. For decades, environmental justice principles have been identified and developed by grassroots efforts to demand better federal action. So in addition to engaging with federal partners, the writing team set up a federal register notice, a tribal consultation, a roundtable with U.S. territories and Native Hawaiian organizations, and the first ever virtual summit on ocean justice. And just from the federal register notice alone, we gathered almost 16,000 comments. So the demand for this type of integration was really clear. And we also identified nuances that members of the ocean community face that are not fully addressed or considered by the traditional environmental justice definition and interpretation. We adapted the definition of ocean justice from the Executive Order 14096 definition, where ocean justice refers to the just treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of income, race, color, national origin, tribal affiliation, or disability, and federal agency decision-making and other federal activities that are related to the ocean. And when we say ocean, we mean the ocean, the coastlines, and the Great Lakes. We then applied our definition to communities who rely on these regions for economic, cultural, spiritual, recreational purposes, and food security. This includes communities who have been disproportionately burdened by the negative outcomes of human activities in and around the ocean, including Black, Latino, Indigenous, and Native American, Asian American, Native Hawaiian, or Pacific Islander, communities with a significant proportion of people who experience persistent poverty or other forms of social inequality, geographically dispersed and mobile populations. So you can think about this like migrant fishers who have been displaced by environmental hazards or inequitable development practices. and also communities that are not limited to shoreline. So the strategy is meant to serve a lot of people. It's supposed to support federal activities across multiple roles and functions. So taking this all together, the role of the ocean justice strategy is meant to be intersectional, intersectoral, and adaptable in order to achieve this scope. The strategy promotes work towards repairing past harms and provides a lens through which to think through past, current, or future impacts to the ocean. And because it's so intersectional, it's adaptable not just to different agency and office roles, but also different scales of government, like at the local and state scale. The OJS is structured on 3 broad recommendations: how to embed ocean justice in federal activities, how to develop a diverse, equitable, inclusive, and accessible federal ocean workforce, and how to enhance ocean justice through education, data, and knowledge. So to help visualize translating these recommendations into concrete actions, the strategy also includes 7 federal case studies that span regulatory funding and/or resource management responsibilities. So I encourage anyone looking for ideas for furthering ocean justice to reference these case studies as a template for what you could be doing in your own space. Break. Wonderful. All right, now we're moving on to the Environmental Justice Science Data and Research Plan, also known as the EJSDRP. This, as I said, was developed by the National Science and Technology Council's Environmental Justice Subcommittee as a mandate of Executive Order 14096. So the plan provides principles, information, and resources to assist agencies in order to advance the different mandates within this executive order. And what's great about it is that it offers more tangible recommendations. You can think of the ocean justice strategy as a 30,000-foot view that offers thematic guidance to further more equitable practices. The EJSDRP's recommendations can be viewed as action items that can address each OJS theme and objective and are just as adaptable to scale as the OJS. Within the plan are 17 recommendations for advancing environmental justice and federal science, data, and research, and these are focused under 4 different themes. The recommendations include how to meaningfully involve and engage the public, how to ensure that those vulnerable to environmental injustice receive just and equitable treatment, access, and protection, how to strengthen work in partnerships with non-federal entities, and how to institutionalize these practices as part of the culture. Because when you practice environmental justice, you raise all ships, so to speak. So how to normalize this work, turning it from an add-on to a keystone part of your process. And developing these practices as keystones within your activities can yield an additional co-benefit, because by implementing these recommendations, you can provide a form of workforce training through learning by doing. And by normalizing this, you can help cement process-based knowledge for future project and program design and review. So, as I said, there are 17 total recommendations in the plan, each with example action items from existing federal activities and more concrete objectives that you can achieve. Multiple recommendations are cross-cutting and can also be seen as part of normal management practices. So, going into specific needs like those related to qualitative data collection, how to bring together interdisciplinary efforts, and public engagement. So I listed 2 overarching, 2 cross-cutting kind of recommendations here, but just note there are multiple specific recommendations that speak to these 2 bullet points that I put on the slide. Many recommendations speak to a risk analysis on what gaps and inadequacies exist in current practices for data collection and scientific research, and then building on identifying those gaps, identifying the opportunities for coordination outside of the government to fill those gaps. Environmental justice work started and continues to persist outside of government activity. So these recommendations speak to assessing within your own space, what can we do better, and what can we do better as a team with others. The recommendations encourage coalition building to fill in the gaps rather than they don't stress a top-down only approach, which can create silos. They also don't stress bottom-up only approaches, which can self-select for only those with bandwidth capacity and existing networks to reach out. If you encourage both directions of engagement, you can strengthen the overall network and build more resilient partnerships. Okay, used together, both the Ocean Justice Strategy and the Environmental Justice Science Data and Research Plan can assist with activities like regulatory planning, funding and grant development and review, disaster preparedness, and/or economic development, to review. So I want to dig a little bit deeper into them using kind of a case study in which your office is considering an mCDR or OA project. These recommendations could be helpful for reviewing a project that was submitted for permitting, for example, or it could be a project that your office is considering initiating, or maybe you're thinking more proactively at this stage and you want to set up a place-based knowledge trust for future projects as they come down the pipe. Okie dokie. First idea. How to enhance and strengthen existing methods for scientific monitoring and data collection. mCDR research makes up a lot of moving parts in data, and when we think about public engagement, it's important to make that data transparent. Also, words really matter, so what transparency means can be very different depending on someone's technical expertise and literacy within the field. So one idea is to assess how well a project's data management plan follows the OJS recommendation 3.3. which applies an ocean justice lens to ocean research and ways of knowing using fair and care data principles. These principles lay out guiding questions for data management and stewardship, respectively, that can ensure more equitable data practices. For example, if we're only looking at FAIR principles in the context of an mCDR project, is the data collected from the project easy to find for humans? Is it easy to find for computers? That can ensure transparency for the public in knowing what is being collected and why. And then, for whom is the data being collected? Is the data accessible for just academics, for people who have expertise or need expertise in data processing tools like R or Linux? Or can someone from the public with limited technical expertise access the data and understand what it means? So one end of the spectrum could be data that's standardized in a way that is aligned with the mCDR community's best practices. And I want to give a shout out to Carbon to Sea because they are revising a data management best practices protocol for ocean alkali enhancement technologies as we speak. So that's one idea. Other end of the spectrum could be data visualizations that are readily available. So figures, tables that are more digestible for the public. Then, can the data be integrated into older systems or systems without institutional capacity? And can it be replicated by individuals from different disciplines or technological ability? This can be a way to ascertain the extent to which an mCDR project's data management plan is shaped with regards to transparency for different experts and the public. Okay, next idea. Ways to develop a diverse, equitable, inclusive, and accessible knowledge trust. Within the same vein as the OJS recommendation 3.3, the EJSDRP recommendation 1.1 suggests that agencies consider how they can develop meaningful opportunities for communities to co-create, shape, determine the priorities of, and/or interpret and validate the findings of science, data, and research activities. This can take the shape of advisory boards and councils that review projects. So one great example is from the Health and Human Services Office and their CAMP project, or including individuals as peer reviewers for proposals or as partners in analysis. And that's seen in the EPA Aspire program. Next, what mechanisms, if any, exist for communities with environmental justice concerns to interpret and validate how the research findings align with their lived experiences or expertise? So thinking about people who know their land, who know their water, like subsistence fishers, and if they can contribute their local knowledge that an incoming or developing mCDR or OA project may benefit from. This could take the form of transition, evaluation, or continuity plans, identifying which checkpoints in a project's life cycle are critical, not just to the mCDR project leads, but to the community for public check-in, feedback, and updates. And then looking at the quantity and quality of these mechanisms. For example, having a website set up for input or asking questions is one thing. And then there's having standing meetings where the community are given a seat at the table, or meetings where they have a mic at the table. They have some representation that has engagement, has a voice. That's something else. Addressing this recommendation can promote that network building between all actors involved that recognize individual strengths and encourages participation. So putting these two recommendations together, these two ideas together, one example in the ocean justice strategy is the Navigating the New Arctic program from NSF. Over 5 years, the program invested $170 million on fundamental convergence research across 5 disciplines to study how natural and built social and environmental systems can help us understand the Arctic and how it has changed under climate change impacts. Proposals were required to speak to co-production of research with Arctic communities. There was a staff community office, there was a podcast, and there was a priorities portal website to facilitate partnership building across the federal research, tribal nation, Arctic, and Indigenous space. So not only were there multiple avenues for engagement and mediums that provided more accessibility and capacity. So for example, let's say a member of the Indigenous community doesn't have access to a website to access the portal, but they do have a phone and therefore can access the quarterly podcast. That's a different type of accessibility that was available. There's also a step in the evaluation process that incentivized projects to do their due diligence in proactive public engagement and partnership building to be eligible for funds and/or permits. Next idea, ways to integrate place-based knowledge and needs with agency work. So the EJSDRP recommendation 13 suggests that federal agencies should establish, strengthen, and/or streamline collaboration and consultation activities with state and local governments and academic, private, and nonprofit institutions that are also engaged in science, data, and research activities. So in other words, do you have the channels for collaboration and consultation within state and local, academic, private, and nonprofit institutions? And within these groups, are there individuals who bring an environmental or ocean justice expertise to the table? Is there social science expertise that can be brought to the table? This can take the form of scientific committees, of working groups that include environmental justice science perspectives. In the same vein as the NSF example, providing pre-funding or permitting requirements can help promote research coalitions for joint research projects and knowledge sharing strategies that include environmental justice or social science priorities. And importantly, this idea can help set evidence-based targets for analyzing any environmental justice outcomes that have been proposed in a project. I think we all know mCDR and OA projects require a lot of moving parts and usually include a lot of different disciplines. And no one person or PI can think of all of these pieces. Like, it's pretty much impossible. So it's important to recognize the individual strengths that can be brought to a project and add the strengths of an interdisciplinary team in a collaborative way. Social science is very much needed in mCDR to understand the public's perception and feelings on these types of projects happening in their community, including understanding potential impacts, both positive and negative. So it's important to really break through disciplinary silos, especially in a field so relatively young, because it not only strengthens the research project and not only builds trust between all actors and the public, but it provides knowledge and foundations for best practices for other regions or offices that are considering the same thing. Within the same idea, the EJSDRP recommendation before can fit within the OJS 1.1 recommendation on providing opportunity for meaningful engagement within the broader goal of embedding ocean justice in federal activities. Some examples that are highlighted in the strategy are included here in this slide. So, for example, in 2021, 2022, NOAA held regional collaboration network climate and equity roundtables to collect information from community partners on their needs in a changing climate. This was to aid NOAA in providing climate services, and it resulted in 7 different pilot projects, like building capacity in Alaska with the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium, building climate communication tools for Native Hawaiian homestead communities, and setting up a community monitoring system for extreme heat in 4 municipalities across the Southwest and Southeast. BOEM improved its processes on offshore wind leasing by encouraging early engagement with tribal nations, underserved communities, and other ocean users in its provisions. The result was quarterly New York and New Jersey offshore forums on environmental justice and the establishment of input status reports to track public input and how each input would be addressed. Okay. Takeaways. So I only touched on a few of the recommendations in these strategies, and with the case studies and examples presented, I hope you can come away with feasible ideas to embed these principles into your own activities. You can start with an analysis of any gaps in the research practices you do. You can look at ways to collaborate or coordinate to build capacity in partnership with the local public or environmental and ocean justice experts when reviewing projects. And you can promote education, data, and knowledge through increased accessibility of data, as well as integrate that data with the lived expertise and knowledge of the local community. And this is only a little bit of what's in these strategies. So I encourage you, again, dig into these documents more. The bottom line I want to leave you with is that these strategies are meant to enhance existing processes. Your current work can be elevated and strengthened through a lens that comes from community perspectives and needs, whether your processes fall under regulatory, funding, or management purviews. And using these strategies in tandem can be great first steps to start those conversations and analyses of what you could be doing in your sphere of influence and work. So with that, here's a picture of the Ocean Justice Strategy writing team as we're creating this document. Quick rundown of Ocean Justice Strategy and a little bit about the NSTC Environmental Justice Science Data and Research Plan. I really appreciate your time. If you have any questions, you can email me below, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have during this session. Thank you.
All right, we're gonna send it on over to Sarah. Whenever you're ready, go right ahead.
Awesome. Let me share my screen. Hopefully I'm sharing the right presentation. I had a amusing snafu last week where I shared something totally different. So here we are. Okay, well, I already introduced myself. Can you all see my screen? I should just check.
Yes, you are all
Awesome.
good. And it is the correct
Great.
presentation.
That's helpful. Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And it's great to talk after Amelia. I think there's a lot of overlaps between things that Amelia touched on and what I'll touch on in my talk. So I already gave my kind of bio background, but for folks who may have missed it, my name is Sarah Nawaz. I'm an environmental social scientist at the Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal. And I'm hoping to talk today about some ideas for making research and deployment of marine CDR more responsible, and particularly bringing in work that I've been doing in sort of social science research on this front. So yeah, I'll talk about kind of my idea and sort of general collective ideas as well about what it means to call sort of research and deployment responsible. I'll try to share some learnings as they apply to governance from 3 sets of engagement research workshops that I've done on marine CDR. I'll reflect a little bit on community engagement, particularly in what I think needs to happen to make it more oriented towards producing responsible and effective mCDR research and deployment, and hopefully have time to wrap up with some kind of policy proposals at the end. Okay, so a few broad thoughts on what does it mean to talk about kind of calling research and deployment for mCDR responsible. A lot of the sources that I'm drawing on for these first comments I'll make, or these first ideas I'll share, are sort of big picture principles, codes of conduct. I've noted in the bottom left corner of the slide, like the Oxford Principles for Geoengineering, the Aspen Institute's Code of Conduct on mCDR research, but there's also been a kind of a host of other social science scholarship that sort of laid out, okay, this is what it means to do something like mCDR in a sort of responsible way. And the first piece, I think, is a general agreement that we should be orienting to the public good. We should be governing these technologies as something that sort of benefits society generally. We also should be independently assessing impacts, and we should be transparently sharing the research and data and information that comes out of this. We should be co-developing research and involving the public and communities that will be affected in decision making. And that's a lot of what I'll talk about in my presentation today. But a couple of things I wanted to mention as well is I think there's a broad agreement in the literature that removals really should not and cannot substitute for emissions reduction. So carbon removal is something we need to be doing alongside emissions reductions. And I couldn't help but just weave in some ideas that I worked on with some colleagues. I've just dropped the little citation for that work in the bottom right-hand corner, but some other ideas that came out of an effort that we undertook to try to think about, okay, how should and can carbon removal support a just transition? And the first idea is really, we need to be thinking carefully about what we're doing carbon removal for. So are we doing it to offset sort of a CEO's private jet flight, or are we doing it to ensure that we can continue to compensate, or we can compensate for emissions associated with, say, food production for the world's poorest communities? So that's one piece that I would also add to this list of kind of responsibility and principles of responsibility. And another piece relates to how we assess like the ambition we should have around CDR. So a lot of the kind of general targets you'll see in the sort of writing about carbon removal is we need to have 10 gigatons a year by 2050 or something to that effect. And a lot of those numbers are pretty top-down numbers. So they're sort of saying, okay, the modeling tells us we need to get there. And what I would argue for is that we need to be thinking at a more bottom-up way. So doing kind of geographically situated research that says what is actually sustainable at this particular location, both environmentally and socially, and kind of work our way up to say, where does that actually get us in terms of responsible, sustainable scale of CDR that might be possible? So switching from that kind of bigger picture conversation about responsibility, I'll share a little bit of research that I did, like I've mentioned, around where we're trying to get at sort of how do people think about mCDR technologies, under what conditions does support or rejection arise, and also kind of I'll try to orient this to what these findings tell us about designing governance of marine CDR. So the work I'll talk about, excuse me, is work that is really situated in the Pacific Northwest, Washington State, and British Columbia across 3 locations. So we have the first study in Victoria, BC. The tech focus was 3 technologies, an offshore direct air capture and storage project, which was sort of the context of this overall work. And it was an academic feasibility study looking at that technology. And we also looked at ocean alkalinity enhancement and marine biomass sinking as sort of 2 other comparative technologies. The other study was in the Olympic Peninsula in Washington, where we really were thinking about ocean alkalinity enhancement exclusively. This was a standalone kind of social science research study, but it was oriented to that specific geography because it is a site of interest and planned trials in ocean alkalinity enhancement. And then the last one, which is sort of an ongoing project, is in Vancouver, BC, ocean alkalinity enhancement as well. And it's being conducted in anticipation of a field trial there. So for this first study, I'm just going to kind of give you a little bit of background on kind of what we were doing with participants, and then try to kind of pull out a few findings and learnings across these 3 studies. So the first study in Victoria, what we were really trying to think about or do with participants here is understand how people might think about different technologies, compared to each other, but also how they might think about these at scale. So one of the things we did was we presented participants with different posters that kind of described each a different marine carbon removal approach that might be possible or considered in British Columbia, and specifically within the next few decades at the scale of 2 megatons per year, which is approximately 10% of what is anticipated that British Columbia will need to be doing in the coming decades annually for carbon removal. And the groups we were working with here were a range of sort of environmental NGO members and staff, and also First Nations members. And I guess the other thing I would say here is we really tried to kind of we presented posters of these 3 different approaches, and we really tried to make them tangible to folks. So things like, how much sort of ocean surface would need to be used to farm macroalgae if you wanted to grow it and then sink it. What kind of like local provincial park might that be comparable to? Really trying to make the scale aspects something that people could wrap their heads around. And this little photo I've got on my next slide is an example of a sort of in-depth poster like I'm describing that we discussed with participants, sort of outlining what one technology would look like at scale. And the thing I'll really highlight here, I mean, lots of learnings from this workshop, like all of them, but one thing I'll really highlight here is that scale, we found, really impacted views in different directions. So some people, were very skeptical and worried about big scales of deployment or bigger scales of deployment. And particularly, I'll say around kind of questions of naturalness. So this idea of like, okay, I thought this thing seemed really great when done at a small scale, but actually now that you're talking to me about this kind of 2 megaton scale, this larger scale, I'm starting to think that this system or this process is not quite as natural as I initially thought. And then on the flip side, other folks who were saying, actually, I don't really want to be doing any of this unless we're doing it at a larger scale, because that makes it worth it. That kind of contribution overall makes it worth it. The other thing I'd flag really quickly here is that I think when we're talking about this large scale, questions of mining, so for mineral-based ocean alkalinity enhancement, I didn't explain the technology at all, assuming a degree of familiarity that may or may not be here with this audience, but the idea being if you're using large amounts of minerals to do ocean alkalinity enhancement, that was also where questions of scale really came up, and people saying, this makes me, think a lot about mining, and I'm not sure how I feel about it. It has a lot of negative associations, I would say, for some folks and for maybe a fair number of folks in British Columbia. So this next study that I'll talk about quickly, like I mentioned already, sort of an independent, just purely social science research study, but wanting to focus on a location increasingly being considered. And that is the sort of northwest corner of Washington State. We've got Pacific Northwest National Lab and the company Ebb Carbon, who've been collaborating on research at the lab's Sequim, Washington location, which is sort of along the north coast of that, if you can see on my slide. And Ebb now has a field trial that's, I believe, now permitted at the Port of Port Angeles. Also probably hard to see in my map, but up there on that north coast. And the finding I'll kind of focus on here, and this was a finding really across multiple studies that I'm talking about, is that yes, like the technology matters. People have lots of thoughts on sort of different ways that you can set up the kind of technical system, but governance aspects and political economic systems in which these technologies are embedded may matter even more. So left-hand side of my slide has an example of some of these kind of 4 future scenarios that we used to discuss with participants in a little exercise that we did as part of the workshop. And what I really want to highlight is that a couple of things that really stood out from what folks said about their perspectives on governance and the political economic system, I will say that there was a lot of skepticism around kind of private ownership, corporate economic models that were really a lens through which people viewed the technology of ocean alkalinity enhancement. And they really expressed a lot of preferences for ownership models led by cooperatives, sort of collective ownership models. Tribal ownership was really discussed not just by tribal staff that participated in these workshops, but also by others, from shellfish farmers to environmental NGOs and local educators, those other kind of participants that we had. And I will also just say that this finding of ours really aligns with some other recent work came out last year, a survey in the UK by Emily Cox and her colleagues, in which she found that there was a very strong preference for implementing OAE within sort of contexts of small scale deployment, decentralization, modularity, and also similarly to what we found, kind of this idea of cooperative or local ownership structures. And folks really kind of rejected OAE in the context of scenarios, governance-wise and sort of economically, that most closely resembled kind of our current status quo of private deployment and sort of market based approaches. And maybe one last thing that I'll say about a finding from this work is we also really found that the use of waste products, existing infrastructure were really appealing to participants. They preferred the idea of kind of using existing materials and infrastructure rather than building a bunch of new stuff or mining a bunch of new stuff. So there's a sort of inherent preference that we found for kind of, yeah, integration, coupling of systems, and that kind of thing. So this third study, it's ongoing right now. I won't talk a ton about it in detail, but essentially we're trying to directly inform doing some workshops with different groups, both public groups and environmental NGOs, to inform a field trial in ocean alkalinity enhancement that's being planned by the company Planetary Technologies at a wastewater treatment facility in Vancouver, British Columbia. So some things, I'll just jump here to kind of general findings across all the studies. The one I'll start with is really, we've found that it's not just marine ecological impacts that matter to people. I mean, that's sort of intuitive that people would care a lot about that, and they certainly do. You know, a lot of questions around what will happen to this species, what will happen in this way. But what we found is that as we've kind of deepened from sort of an initial conversation on mCDR or ocean alkalinity enhancement to talk about the technologies in a little bit more detail, people start to ask a lot of different other types of questions, particularly around supply chains and other industries and activities that are not necessarily occurring in the marine environment that people are understanding will need to occur, co-occur, be sort of be supportive and be integrated into mCDR deployment. I already mentioned this a little bit, but life cycle impacts, mining, for example, but also energy use really matter to people. I mentioned that, you know, they care about these other industries that mCDR is linking with and how they're deployed, both environmentally and I should say also socially. So what are the social impacts of mining far away were things that people wanted to talk about. I talked about the kind of circularity piece already a little bit, and then just coming back to this idea that ownership and financing were themes across all of this work. And I guess just big picture, I'd say, you know, generally there was a lot of interest in these technologies. If it was, you know, also hesitant and skeptical, still a lot of interest in seeing the research continue. However, what we found in our Vancouver work recently with the public sample, which was our only sort of general public sample of all 3 workshops, the rest were sort of folks who maybe were a little bit more tied in because they were working in this space, whether that's through like a natural resource group or something like that. There was a very small, very, very vocally oppositional group in that public sample. And I think that's something we probably need to be anticipating will occur elsewhere. It's tricky because it might be that a lot of people are really excited about something, but a very vocally anti-group can really change the nature of the conversation that you're having. Okay, jumping a little bit, I want to talk about community engagement. So what I think is wrong with the default way we do it, some ideas to a path forward. And I define community engagement as essentially the processes by which different groups are involved in making decisions that affect them. So I've just described sort of social science research I'm doing. A lot of that has been pretty, I would say, applied research. Like we're trying to understand what people think, but we're also trying to use that information to inform decisions on a specific project or trial. But I think that engaging communities on new projects like marine CDR projects is often done by folks who aren't social, they aren't researchers. They're not going to write up their results and try to publish them in a peer-reviewed journal. They're practitioners, maybe they're project developers, maybe they're consultants. And I think that really, that's generally speaking the way that most potentially affected communities are consulted on kind of different infrastructure projects in other sectors. And so I have some thoughts on that. I will start by talking about the kind of the spectrum of things that engagement can mean to some of these different folks who are practicing engagement. So I have this little spectrum. It's from the International Association for Public Participation. It's not my spectrum. I'll just run through it really quickly. But what I want to say about it is essentially that, generally speaking, sort of social scientists, engagement practitioners who do this all the time generally agree that best practice is considered to be moving right along this spectrum. So we want to be going from lesser to greater ability of communities to participate in a project, in decision making about a project. So on the far left, we've got approaches to engagement that are really considered outreach. So you're just sort of telling a community or group of communities information about what you're planning to do. We've got consultation next, where maybe you're also asking for some input from communities. We've got then involvement. To some extent, you're considering community goals and concerns in your decisions. Then we've got collaboration, where you're actually bringing in, like a project is actually bringing in communities to shape outcomes in some way. And then the final kind of, I would say, gold standard of what it means to do participation engagement well is where there's shared leadership. Communities are having some type of final decision-making power that they hold themselves. So it's not just they have a way to inform decisions, but they're holding some degree of kind of decision-making ability. So yeah, what is wrong with how we're kind of doing community engagement generally now? And by that, I mean both sort of this very early marine CDR sector, but also kind of what's wrong more generally in kind of general like rollout of renewable energy projects or other infrastructure projects that might be somewhat comparable. And the first thing I'll say is we're generally sitting on more to the left of the spectrum. So communities generally aren't really involved in decision making, or it's sort of symbolic in nature, the way that they're consulted. It tends to be quite developer-led engagement. So the problem with that is I think that incentives don't really align up for developers to really meaningfully want or need to center community decisions. But then also I think they're often strapped for time, especially in the context of new marine CDR research. They're often, it's like a PI that is a professor or research scientist who's barely got enough funding to kind of cover their own time, let alone really think meaningfully about how to reach out and involve like a community group in sort of the planning process. And so on. I could say lots more about that, but I think that's one issue. Engagement as a result tends to happen really late in the decision-making process. Maybe, you get to the permitting stage and it's like, okay, now we're realizing we need to do engagement. And then the other thing is it tends to happen in a very sort of project by project way. So you've got a trial in one type of marine CDR or an early research project that's looking at some other type of CDR, and they're doing their own engagement activities. And I think that's okay for now, maybe, but as we scale up as a sector, we're really going to see a lot of engagement fatigue. We've seen this in other sectors where folks just are tapped. Like you can only ask a small community organization or so, sort of a related group to talk to you so many times and spend only so much time talking about the subject. So That's a challenge. And also, we're also not learning because you've got one developer over here talking about one thing. They're not necessarily talking to another developer over here. We're not necessarily learning about what are these big picture things that folks in this region want to see, and how can we kind of develop a sector in a way that aligns with what these different groups want to see. A couple just last thoughts are, the result, I think, is that engagement ends up functioning as a way to just push projects through. That's what we see in other sectors. Engagement is just something that is done symbolically, performatively. And I think it's worth noting that for something like marine CDR, which is so early stage and so unknown at present, but also that means that there's the potential for it to it's sort of public image to be tarnished pretty easily. I think it's a big risk when you have engagement that kind of doesn't go well in one place. It has potentially catastrophic spillover effects for other for technologies or developers, or sort of the technology as a whole, I guess I should say. So I think there's a couple of things that engagement really needs to do. The first is, I think it needs to use people's limited bandwidth in a more coordinated and strategic way. I think we need to talk to people not just about one project, but also, what are the different other types of technology on the table? What are the different options? What are connected sectors that marine CDR would rely upon? This could be things like, an unfolding conversation about marine renewables in the Pacific Northwest that needs to kind of co-occur with conversations about marine CDR. I think it needs to be facilitated by an independent actor. I think that builds a lot of trust. If you've got someone leading the conversation that doesn't have a material incentive towards any one particular outcome. And I think that we should try to find a way to kind of systematically learn from the engagement that's already happening by having kind of perhaps some sort of central, transparent documentation of, what kind of conversations and deliberations are happening, and what are we finding out from them. So my kind of thing that I've been talking about a lot recently is a proposal for sort of a more regional level engagement body that's tasked with doing engagement for broadly, I would say, the kind of climate and energy transition. That includes CDR and marine CDR, but other technologies as well, like clean energy. And I think this would mean sort of not being led by a single developer, but a kind of a coalition of actors who don't have an interest in any one particular outcome. Like I said, could be sort of a coalition of maybe public sector, private sector, university researchers, civil society groups. I think it could look a lot of different ways, but for me, the core of the concept is really thinking about doing engagement in a coordinated, independent way that builds understanding across the sector about what people really want and how they want to see it evolve. So just to wrap up, some ideas on how we can support responsible research and deployment for marine CDR. A lot of this is really oriented around kind of engagement work in social science, because that's what I focus on a lot today. If you want to chat about other ideas, I have many, but I'll just try to sort of keep it more focused on that for now. The first piece is funding, not to be sort of the social scientist saying, let's fund more social science, but I do really think that work is important and underfunded at present. We should be doing engagement and social research alongside trials and beyond them, and maybe even before as well, alongside early lab studies and mesocosm experiments and that kind of thing. I think we need to be doing engagement early, so well before the permitting process begins. I think we also need to have really transparent plans for what research projects and larger deployments will do to actually integrate findings from engagement into project decision-making, being really clear about how we're using those findings. Shifting from project level to sector level engagement is what I just kind of talked about, so I won't recap too much. Something I haven't talked about is respect for Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination. I think there needs to be a sort of commitment that is made both at project levels, but also at a sort of sector level in this regard. I think we need to also be thinking about new ways to integrate communities and citizens into doing the science itself, not just being sort of recipients of the science. We've got a really, I think, really exciting project with Seaworthy to try to do some of this kind of work alongside sort of integrating communities into modeling efforts and helping them shape the idea of what it is to, what are the sort of scenarios for deployment that we're considering. But there's lots of other things I think you could do to integrate people into the making of the science itself. This goes back to my conversation about political economic systems and governance models, but it seems like there's a lot of interest in some of these more community-led, cooperatively led projects. And so exploring more about that could be a really important thing to pursue. Going back to my very early ideas about what is responsible deployment, I think we should be having a conversation, not just with us as sort of an expert group, but generally the public, about what are we doing marine CDR for? Like, what is it intended to offset? And finally, I think that there's a lot of learnings from this kind of engagement or other social research that can inform some of the sort of bottom-up assessments that I also mentioned at the beginning of my talk. So that's all I've got. One thing I'll note is my colleague Julia Bellotti and I are working on a best practice guide on engaging communities on ocean alkalinity enhancement that should be coming out in the next month or so. So would love to share that with anyone who's interested to check it out. And thanks so much.
You're muted, Janet.
Good, Janet.
Thank you. So thank you again to both of our speakers. And I do have a question coming in. And I just want to remind everyone that if you have questions, you can either put them in the Q&A or the chat. It looks like we have questions coming into both. So the first question is, and I guess this is for either one of you, are you aware of any case studies or examples of engagement that include dedicated funding and time for two-way dialogue, especially those in which the benefits flow back into the community?
I'm happy to take first stab at it. I don't know. Oh, okay, this might be better. Got to bring my microphone down. I can't tell from the question if it was mCDR or OA focused, but from my experience at NSF, there's a program called Civic, CIVIC. And what I really love about Civic is that the proposals are submitted for 1-year projects for $1 million of funding. And one of the key requirements is that there needs to be like public engagement, but specifically two-way dialogue where the benefits and outcomes of the project are staying with the local community after the project has concluded. So there's a requirement for sustained co-benefits that are being provided to the communities. And I would say that like some proposals that jumped out to me were where you would have a contract of local community members who were hired as part of that project, or there was a sign off by the local government where the timeline for check-ins and feedback is a lot more integrated into the projects, especially when the outcomes, like after the principal investigators, after the researchers have left the site, the maintenance or upkeep and just, reaping the fruits of the labor or continuing to stay with that community.
The other thing I would mention is just it's not a marine CDR project, but CalDAC is a project that was funded under the DAC Hub's funding, the direct air capture, the Department of Energy sort of big funding for direct air capture projects. That is a kind of an equity focused feasibility study trying to basically explore from a very kind of like community perspective, what kind of a direct air capture project could be possible in California. I can share some information on that. I don't have a ton of firsthand knowledge. I'm not part of that project, but that's sort of the main example I think of in the CDR space for I think what the participant was asking. Yeah.
Thank you. I I just wanted to make a comment, Sarah, on one of the things that you said, that we should have a more transparent engagement and some kind of like place where we can share knowledge openly and, I guess, transparently, obviously. But I just want to kind of add on to that, because I agree with you. And I think it's the language and the words that we choose as well to share that knowledge. And I also just wanted to highlight that the cans from each region are a great place for that, because our websites are very stakeholder oriented. So perhaps in the future, there's some chances for some collaboration and including more information on our websites about mCDR. And I do not have any other questions rolling in.
I had a question for Sarah. So I guess in previous conversations I've had in the mCDR space, there's been kind of a hesitancy for just to kind of connect with social scientists. I think from what I was gathering, it was that the hesitancy is because I think there's an expectation that there just aren't any social scientists that are studying. There aren't enough social scientists that are studying mCDR, so the capacity is really limited. And me coming as a non-oceanographer, I like my first thought was like, well, you just like go across the aisle, you go to the social science department, whatever it's called in your institution, and you just approach it as a question rather than a systems focused kind of question, just a broader question. So I just wanted to pick your brain, Sarah, on how translatable asking social science mCDR questions are for just social science at large.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think there definitely are not enough folks who are social scientists thinking about this topic. And I think it'd be, a great idea for maybe this is something my institute, needs to take on, sort of like a summer school or something like that, to say, hey, this is a topic that you all have a ton of skills that you could bring to the table here, but you just need a little bit more background information to be able to meaningfully collaborate with, be able to easily and meaningfully kind of jump into projects. So I think that, there's like maybe some sector building sort of, and by sector building, I mean building of a group of social scientists who are interested and capable of working on this topic. But I think generally, like, I really agree. There's so many amazing social scientists who have so many insights that they bring because they come from different backgrounds, whether that's public perceptions of emerging technology, which is sort of more my background, or marine social science, or energy justice related scholars or things like that. There's, I think, a lot of places where people could be pulled in. And there's something else I was going to say, but I don't remember. So I'll stop talking.
Speaking of being pulled into projects, there's a question for you, Sarah. If you've ever worked with the fishing industry, and if so, do you have any suggestions on how to best engage those communities?
Yeah, I was going to say there is a colleague, Sarah Schumann, who has been she received funding through the I guess the sort of the NOAA mCDR round of funding to work specifically with the fishing community on mCDR. So I feel like she would be a much better person to talk to about that than me. I don't have a ton of experience other than that is something that we absolutely should be doing as part of this work, I think. I could also share her like some writing that Sarah has done, but she's working particularly, I think, in the Northeast. So maybe that'd be of relevance, but super important question. Yeah. And I think generally in terms of how best to engage, I would say a lot of the general kind of principles of engagement apply to fishing industry, which I mean, I won't get into now, but basically just to say that general principles apply. And one of those is to really deep dive into history and like knowing who those folks are and what their kind of background is, where they're coming to the table from. So I would say that's an essential piece of that as well.
Great, thank you. I think a lot of us are interested in our colleagues, who they are right now. And I see, so Sarah is going to answer that question in the Q&A. I think probably share a name and contact information, or at least an affiliation. So if you need help reaching out to anyone, you can either contact Sarah or myself, and we'll try to get you in touch with the right people. So I'm not seeing any other questions right now, and we are just about at our time. So I want to thank the panelists for joining us today. And I do believe that either one or both of you are also giving another talk next week with for the Alaska Ocean Acidification Network. So definitely tune into that one as well. I did see Darcy Dugan from the Alaska Can on the line today. So I hope that this was informative to everyone. And again, look for the recording on the MACAN website in a couple of days, and watch out for emails reminding you to register for the rest of our webinar series. So thanks again to everyone, and we'll see you at our next webinar.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you all. Take care.